Well, today I'm joined by Professor Amy Peeler, who's a professor of New Testament at Wheaton University. And
It's actually Wheaton College. And then we have a graduate school as well, but we're still college.
okay, wonderful. And I'm fortunate to know Amy through my in-laws, Charles and Darlene Bressler, who were also professors with Amy at Indiana Wesleyan. But Amy has gone on to write several books, one a commentary on Hebrews, and one a book about gender and God. And she's done a fair bit of work on Mary in the New Testament. So thanks for having this conversation with me today, Amy. And I look forward to learning from you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, and really the kind of big, challenging questions of God and gender. For me, I do believe that pressing into the incarnation, Mary's role in it, is a really healthy way forward for Christians to navigate some complicated terrain. So I'm always delighted to draw attention to how God invited her to be part of salvation's story. So glad to talk with you about that today.
Thank you so much. Well, the first question I have for you is, what do you think Mary has to teach women and
Mm.
men about the role of women in the life of the church?
Yeah. That's a really excellent question. I come from particular spaces. I grew up Southern Baptist. I learned how to love the Bible and studied it well, a lot of gifts in that upbringing. But one particular issue that was quite prominent in my early adulthood was this question of women's roles in the church in particular. I recognize that's a question that had been asked for a long time, but in the late 90s, it was resurfacing in particular ways. Often in Protestant spaces, the question turns almost immediately to the literature of Paul, and that makes sense. He praises some female coworkers, but he also has a few places that, at least on an initial read, sound like women should not be vocally contributing to church worship. So that's where the conversation goes. I believe that on these questions about women serving and men serving, a partnership together, Mary has quite a bit to offer for both men and women. I love how you put that question. What we find of her in scripture is that God used her in a multi-dimensional way. And I think we'll get to this question in just a moment. But the beginning point is that she demonstrates faith. And I think this is beautifully presented to us by Luke in the Annunciation. When Gabriel comes to her and says, "You will have the opportunity to bear the Messiah." Wow, what amazing honor, right? And the language she's given, your son will inhabit the throne of his ancestor David forever. There were definitely many Jews who were looking forward to a righteous leader who was coming. And so that she was extended this invitation is quite amazing. But what I love about that account is that she doesn't immediately be like, "Awesome, I'm in." Like there is a thoughtfulness in her. She's questioning, she's hesitant at first, which for a young woman, there's absolutely no indication of a thoughtlessness or a pluckiness. She's a deep person already, I think, and we're shown that in the Annunciation. So her faith then manifests in a really eye open, like she understands this is an honor. She understands there's a cost to this invitation. An open-eyed, yes, yes, I will be a servant of the Lord. And so we get to see her grit at the very beginning. And then that really continues. She isn't just present at Jesus's birth. She's mentioned a few times in his ministry. We might think prominently of the wedding at Cana. She is present there at the eve of Pentecost. She's with the other faithful, gathered in prayer, waiting for the Spirit. So her story is not a one-off. She's some kind of vessel through which God comes into the world in the person of the Son. No, she is an active, ongoing participant in the ministry of Jesus. And if that reality, her story, stands at the center of the Christian gospel, God came to save the world and became incarnate, I think then we would do quite well to pay attention to that as we turn to the conversations of women's participation in God's work. Now, that doesn't solve all the issues, and Christians of good faith may make different decisions. But oh my goodness, it does say God is not resistant or does not put women in a second class place. God says, this is how I will save the world. And I'm going to invite Mary first. She's the first one to participate in this work. So that is quite a beautiful thing. And I think for men then, and I've reflected quite a bit about masculinity. I have some colleagues who write in that area. I know this is a very upfront conversation in culture right now. Young men seem to be struggling. As the mother of daughter and 2 sons, as one who cares about all of my students, I would never wish for the pendulum to swing in such a way that if we are more open and excited about including women by paying attention to Mary's story, that somehow is a detriment to men. And I firmly believe that's not what New Testament gives us, the whole of Scripture gives us, because as women are brought in, then men are freed not only to press into their gifts, but to see the beauty of the complement, and I will use that word, even though that can be complicated in some spaces, the complement of what women bring as well. They're actually freed, if I might put it frankly, from having to do everything, to which I don't believe God actually calls men. They're freed to press into their own gifts. So it's a win-win. It's not a zero-sum game or a limited pie. The economy of God's kingdom is absolute abundance, and that's for everyone. And I think she, in her multiple ways of serving, begins to help us see that at the center of salvation.
Yeah. Yeah. You brought up the wedding at Cana, and
Yeah,
I love Mary is the one who kind of initiates Jesus.
precisely.
Yeah. And I think of the encounter of Mary and Jesus' siblings who stand
Exactly.
outside the house and say,
Right.
come outside. Uh,
Yes.
they tell them your mother and your siblings are outside.
Mm-hmm.
Who are my mother and my brothers and
Right.
my sisters?
Yes.
Even if there's a kind of misunderstanding there, something
Right.
Mary's encounter
Mm.
with Jesus' ministry there sort of provokes the ministry in a different direction.
Yes. Oh, that's so well said. I think that's a really vital text. A colleague and I teach a class on Mary. We've done so now for 6 years. It's a very wonderful class. But we actually start with that encounter because it might seem on the surface that Jesus is dismissing her. You're not part of the inner circle, these people around me. But yet, read in the whole of the narratives, particularly of Matthew and Luke, although I think you can get there with Mark as well, that is no way a diminishment of Mary, but it is a statement that bloodline doesn't give one special access in this kingdom, in this family. It is by faith alone. And who has done the will of God in a more exemplary way by that point in the narrative than Mary herself? And moreover, not only is she included, but I do think this pushes against maybe a temptation to limit her to her womb. She is not just a walking womb. That is a very important, that is why we know her contribution, but she's not flattened to her body. And that's an important factor as we think about women's inclusion. No, she gets in by faith. Now, that faith manifests in a way that won't be true for anyone else in human history through her body, but it is not limited to that. So I think that's actually a very key place to begin our exploration, is to look at her example of faith, which for the church history, I'm sure you're very well aware of this, all aspects of the church, Orthodox, Catholic, various forms of Protestants, have been very comfortable in lifting up Mary as a chief exemplar of faith for men and women. Saying yes to God is something we're all invited to do.
Mm-hmm. So, thinking about the New Testament, obviously Christians want to honor the New Testament and let it shape our lives. What do you think we ought to believe about Mary on the basis of the New Testament?
Yeah. Yes. Even your question kind of previews There's lots of development about her, and this is so early. Believers are hungry to know more about the story. And so there's lots of things that develop. And I think that's actually beautiful, but it kind of goes in some challenging ways in the future. But in the New Testament itself, I think when I first started this work, I thought, oh, there's not very much about her in the New Testament. And that is true. You can kind of get basically on two hands all of the references. And yet, and this is what I always find true about scripture, it is so rich. Even if we think the thin line of those handful of references, wow, the depth beneath is inexhaustible, to the point that in 15 weeks of this class on Mary, we always say, oh, and we've run out of time. We've not had enough time to do all that we want. And that's been true in my own writing as well, just treasure after treasure as we contemplate. So I do think it's very important that we respect her particularity. I think that Jewish scholars have been very beneficial to help us not to make her just kind of some symbol or form, but she is of a lower economic class, Jewish young woman in the first century. And that particularity is scandalous, maybe, that God chose her, God chose this people, and we can't ever get away from her locatedness. I think that actually makes her more relatable when we know that she was a real human and had all the experiences that humans do. So I think that's quite important. And then, as I've already mentioned, let's not relegate her to Christmas alone. That's a fruitful time, and when we should think intentionally about what she was willing to do, but her story extends. And that is very clear in the New Testament, even into Pentecost. And I believe the exegesis well supports that she was one of the preachers at Pentecost, along with Peter and the other followers of Jesus. And Peter says, you all who are standing here have seen the fulfillment of the prophecy of Joel, that sons and daughters, male and female slaves, have proclaimed this good news to you. He couldn't state that with truth had there not been female voices in the first moment of preaching. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. But then finally, I would say we do have to respect that there are gaps. There are things we'd like to know that we don't. And that's been really beneficial in my engagement with Catholic friends and Catholic scholarship. There are decisions that Catholic theology make about Mary that I do not find are egregious. They're not against the text. They're just not very clearly explicit within the text. And so I can honor the decisions that they've made exegetically without feeling the burden to take on the fullness of their doctrine. What they believe often is allowed by scripture, but not demanded by it. And it's been fascinating as I've come to so appreciate the wealth of the Orthodox and Catholic traditions of the faith. I've also, every time I teach the class, I feel more fully rooted as a Protestant. That there are decisions that put scripture and kind of its plain reading at a premium for me. Not that they do not care about scripture. They care and know more often than many of Protestants do. But there is an allowance of the development of doctrine that can be beneficial in some ways. And in some ways, I think it produces some difficulties. So we have what we have. It's enough for a life worth of study. And again, it shows us how Mary was continually involved in the ministry of Jesus.
Yeah. 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 Well, you mentioned Catholic and Orthodox beliefs about Mary. And obviously, for many of us Protestants who are exposed to the worship and devotion of our Catholic and Orthodox brothers and sisters, we can be a little bit bewildered.
Yes.
That there's more room in our worship and devotion as Protestants for Mary. And what might that look like?
Yes, yes. Oh, that's a beautiful question. And maybe that's what I have learned by sitting with them in long and deep ways. Maybe the first thing that comes to mind is, and this is not just applicable to Mary, but to the saints writ large, I certainly did not grow up in a tradition where we thought much about the saints, nor would we ever reach out to them in something that looks like prayer. That was a bit of anathema. I've come to understand, not only in conversation with Catholic friends, but also through my own exegesis of Hebrews, interestingly, that there is a community of faith that is stronger than the power of death. If we claim the truth of the resurrection, then those saints who are before us, who are observing us run the race of faith, could there not be an exchange there in some way? I found myself at Notre Dame in a time in which a dear friend, really my best friend from college, had a pregnancy that was going to come to an end. And this was incredibly difficult, as you would imagine. She ended up carrying her son to term, and then he only lived a few hours. But in the midst of that season, I was at Notre Dame, and of course they have the grotto there. It's a very key part of campus. I was there early one morning, and I really was compelled to present my hurt, my friend's hurt, ask for advocacy of Mary, who had walked that road of losing a son. And I wouldn't articulate that as prayer. I would articulate that in the same way that I would ask other friends, would you pray for me? Because if the veil of death is really much thinner than we might imagine because of the resurrection of Christ, I see nothing out of bounds by asking the Church Triumphant to intercede for us, as I would any friend. Now, that has not become a regular part of my prayer practice, and there's no resistance to it. There have only been very few moments in which that's been evoked for me. But I think that's something to contemplate. I see no rules against that in the New Testament. Now, it has in some places developed in such a way that a person might go to the saints and not go to God. But I really think the root of the difficulty, the problem there, is not the saints, but how that person is viewing God. As God becomes viewed as more wrathful and only full of judgment and distant and scary, then more and more the laity will turn to the saints and to Mary. Almost, well, she's the nice one. I don't want to deal with God. But that's really a false view of who God is, whose property is always to have mercy. Not that there isn't justice and vengeance against sin, but there is mercy. And so we don't need to kind of play mom against God our Father. That would be an unhealthy approach. But a very healthy approach could be, friends, might you advocate for me? And in worship, being an Anglican, within the Anglican communion now, Episcopal Church, we say with angels and archangels and with all the community of the faithful, we enter into worship. And I frequently have the sense that either people I've known who have passed or saints that I never knew, we are joined together in worship in some mysterious and beautiful way. So just remembering the tether of those around us, I think, is very beneficial. The second thing I'd say, and this has really just happened this week, our Orthodox and Catholic brothers and sisters have many Marian feasts. And I could kind of walk through like the whole history of that, but they remember her birthday and the day that she was given her name, and they remember the Annunciation. And it's almost as if you cannot get 3 or 4 days and there's not another Marian feast. And I have found that a deep encouragement this year. I found that to be true in Israel as well. I visited Israel for the first time in May, and I felt like everywhere I turned around, there was some remembrance of Mary. Now, I expected to see Jesus everywhere, right? But she was present in places I didn't anticipate. And there's something, every time we look at her, if we're considering her in a holy way, she will remind us of the profound grace of the Incarnation. Like good icons of Mary, she's always pointing to Jesus. And so the more we think about her and celebrate her as our sister, the more we say, wow, God chose not to remain distant, not to save us in some kind of clinical way, but not only death on the cross, but also birth. God is experiencing the full of the human condition. And every time we see her, we celebrate that gift.
Yeah, that's beautifully put.
Well, bless you, bless your people and your ministry. I pray that Advent is a really rich season for you all.
Thank you so much.